Sustainability, the Potsdam Dialogues, Science for a Safe Tomorrow.
We are confronted now with a global energy crisis and a climate crisis.
The climate crisis is really much more urgent than assessed 10 years ago. So we really see that impacts are already kicking in, that they are more dramatic, that there are higher vulnerabilities, maybe that 2 degrees is likely not a safe target with respect to many climate impacts. So we need to do more.
For Europe and for us Europeans, next winter, the following winter will be difficult. We are really experiencing something that we had never seen before.
Hello and welcome back to a new episode of the Sustainability Podcast. I think the title of today's podcast actually says it all. Energy security crisis, cost of living crisis, climate crisis. What's happening and what on earth is the way out? Don't worry, to discuss all these crises, we brought together 2 experts who know all about energy, sustainable energy systems, and what's the latest on a clean energy transition. Welcome Laura Cozzi from the International Energy Agency IEA and Gunnar Luderer from the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research PIK.
Thank you, Julian.
Hello, great to be here.
Cool. So let's just do a quick intro round to get everybody on board, so to say. Laura, you're the Chief Energy Modeler at the IEA. What do you do exactly?
So we try, through the help of computer models, to understand how energy systems may evolve in the future. We are confronted now with a global energy crisis and a climate crisis, and understanding which transformational path the energy sector may take in the years and decades ahead is essential to actually be able to meet this dual challenge. So with the help of models, we try to help policymakers understand what's the best path forward for the energy sector.
Right. And now over to you, Gunnar. You lead the Energy System Group at PIK and are Deputy Chair of the Research Department Transformation Pathways. So what are the focus areas of your research?
So key questions are, what's the role of technologies? What needs to happen in different sectors? Because energy is not only about providing electricity, it's also to a large extent how we use energy in the demand sectors, industry, houses, transport, etc. And then also what kinds of policy we need to pull this off, to really achieve an energy transformation in line with these climate targets.
Great. So you're both exploring ways towards a sustainable, climate-neutral energy supply. Laura more on the policy advising side and Gunnar more on the researching side. So now, at least for me, and maybe also for some of our listeners, from the outside, there's a bit of a split image when it comes to climate targets in general. So on the one hand, it looked like until February this year, we were moving into the right direction. So at COP26 last year, almost 200 countries promised to cut emissions. On the other hand, though, since 2020, global emissions are on the rise again, especially from the use of coal. So it seems like the hunger for energy is steadily rising. And now we are also confronted with this terrible war between Russia and Ukraine. So with all that happening, Gunnar, where do we stand with regards to climate targets?
Maybe we have to differentiate between words and deeds. So regarding the climate policy arena, maybe there are some promising developments. We have to realize that basically international climate diplomacy has started 30 years ago in 1992 with a United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And when I started at PIK 15 years ago, almost 15 years ago, really the focus was on global and very, very long term. But what we've realized is that the climate crisis is really much more urgent than assessed 10 years ago. So we really see that impacts are already kicking in, that they are more dramatic, that there are higher vulnerabilities, maybe that 2 degrees is likely not a safe target with respect to many climate impacts. So we need to do more. And even 30 years into that process, we still haven't peaked our emissions yet. So we are still, we have increased global CO2 emissions over the past decade. There was a bit of a decline in the COVID crisis, but that was not because of structural changes. It was just because of this shock that the pandemic had on the international economy. But what I found encouraging is that the logic of the Paris Agreement, that we have to strengthen our target, that really every country is asked to provide a plan on how to reduce emissions, both in the medium term, let's say until 2030, but then also on the longer term until 2050, with a view on how to get to net zero, to climate neutrality, is extremely helpful. This framing of net zero, we really have to get our emissions to zero. This is what kind of starts to change people's minds, but we really need that to translate into real action and actual emission reductions.
Yeah, very true. Laura, what are your thoughts?
Julian, I think you raised the question in a very, very appropriate way. First of all, I think the Glasgow COP was tremendously important. Why? Because never before we have had so many countries pledging to reach net zero emissions. We have the EU with the net zero target by 2050. We have India committing to net zero by 2070. We have China committing to net zero by 2060. Those are the major largest economies and emitters, and all have now a net zero target. The consequence of that, if the promises made in Glasgow are met, this means that for the first time, we have a global pact that would limit temperature increase below 2 degrees. This has never happened before. So I think this is really something that we need to celebrate. Now, as you said, last year, however, emissions break another record. And most of the reason why we breached another bad record in 2021 is exactly coal. Now, coal use is going up, especially in Asian emerging economies. Despite all the progress we have done on renewables, on solar, coal is soaring. So this is a critical aspect of the clean energy transition that we really need all collectively to work all together. There is one important final point to make here. Are we making progress? Yes, we definitely are. We, at the International Energy Agency, among other things, we are tracking what policies have been put in place after COVID, so what we call the sustainable recoveries. And we found that at the end of April, governments in advanced economies, so EU countries, Germany, Italy, UK, US, Japan, if you look, the money that governments have earmarked to come out of the COVID crisis that goes to clean energy is, first of all, unprecedented. And second, it's in line for this year and next year with the amount of money we would like to see compatible with a net zero by 2050 trajectory. This is something to celebrate. This is excellent news. Does it mean that the private sector is following? We don't know yet, but this from the government perspective is also unprecedented. We had never seen it before. So this is very good news. Now there is another part of the news, is the emerging economies part of the news. Is the amount of money flowing in emerging markets to clean energy technologies up to what we would like to see? No. It's only a fifth. Now, why is the reason? Why is that we are not seeing the amount of clean energy technologies investment going in emerging economies? There are very profound and important reasons. So these economies are being cash debt strapped because of the COVID crisis. They are paying very high cost of capital. So there is really a need for international cooperation to fix this problem, because this is where energy needs are growing, CO2 emissions are growing, and where we need these clean technologies the most.
All right. So a tiny bit, you're giving us some hope here. The situation doesn't seem so bad. But then since February, there is this horrible war. And it seems as if more and more countries are saying we need to supply ourselves with energy. So energy first, climate second, so to say. And Laura, how did the invasion of the Ukraine influence the global situation when it comes to energy and climate matters? What's the IEA's take on it?
So at the International Energy Agency, we are very clearly calling the situation we are in now the first global energy crisis. Why is that? Some of us may remember that in the 70s, we had very high oil prices and we had actually an oil crisis. But today, we are not seeing very high oil prices. We are seeing very high natural gas prices. We are seeing very high coal prices. So it's really the entire fossil system that is at incredibly high level of energy prices and really putting affordability issues front and center, energy security issue front and center, inflation, cost of living front and center. Now, we are confronted with this situation. And this, for us, 23rd of February has changed the course of global energy and climate for the future. Is it clear in which direction? I have to be very honest, no. I think that policymakers here have a critical role to play. So if we want to take a lesson back from the 70s, in the 70s, what has happened? We were confronted with these very high energy prices, and I want to give two examples. Over the span of 4 or 5 years, we have seen the cars that we were selling went to use 20 liters for 100 kilometers to 10 liters for 100 kilometers. So big push on energy efficiency, incredible push on energy efficiency. Why is that? It was a policymaker's decision to enforce very strong efficiency standards. At the same time, we started to diversify. In Europe, back in the 70s, we were still using oil for power generation. In that period, we basically turned very quickly out of oil. We started using other resources. From nuclear, we started using renewables. So started a very big diversification. Now, can the same thing be replicated now and actually be used to accelerate the clean energy transition? And I think that we can certainly solve the energy transition, the energy security crisis, and the climate crisis with the same tools. Is energy efficiency, is renewables. We really need to step up and move ahead. But there is a risk. There is a very clear risk that countries fall back into using coal, especially if they have it domestically. So for us, it's very clear that the solutions today that solve the energy security crisis, the affordability crisis, and the climate crisis are the same. And I repeat them, is the energy efficiency measures, is the renewables, is innovation at large, but we cannot take that for granted. There are some risks out there.
Yeah, all great points. I would like to add that in responding to this energy crisis, it really timescales matter. And we really are in a situation where, especially in Europe, where we have a gap of basically 40% of our natural gas supply that is threatened. On the one hand, it's a tool of power for the autocratic regime in Russia to have this opportunity to take Europe hostage with its reliance on Russian gas. And on the other hand, it's also a moral obligation for us to reduce that reliance on Russian gas and energy in more general. Actually, gas is a smaller part even, given that the fossil resource revenue is such a huge part of Russian governmental income. We're talking about 40–50% of the federal Russian budget. Actually, a big chunk of that is oil. Gas is a smaller one, but really, oil is what matters in terms of the budget mostly for Russia, but gas is what matters in terms of geopolitical power for Russia, and that's kind of this double squeeze that we are in, and we have to respond to that. I think what's very clear along these different timescales, like basically the most critical ones are the next 1 or 2, 3 winters that we need to overcome. We know that most of the gas demand, around half for Germany, goes into heating buildings, and that of course has a seasonality. So we will need more gas in winter times than in the summer, and that actually means that these winters will be critical.
So if Laura, you, me, and everybody else really put some effort into saving energy, so I don't know, we put on an additional jumper this winter, then we could actually overcome the current energy crisis.
What we see from the analysis is that in the end, energy savings are a huge part, but to get over the next 1, 2, 3 winters, we also need to increase fossil imports from elsewhere. And this is painful. And this is about things like setting up new LNG terminals in places like Germany to get alternative supply routes of gas. And this is the part, as opposed to the demand reductions, this is the part where you really have trade-offs in terms of climate policies. So we really have to be very wise and smart about limiting the extent to which we expand fossil infrastructure on the very short term to overcome these shortages to the absolute minimum, because that will be that will create lock-ins that make it harder in the longer term to reach our climate targets.
If I can jump in here, I think Gunnar said something I completely agree, which is for Europe and for us Europeans, next winter, the following winter will be difficult. We are really experiencing something that we had never seen before. Now, policymakers have a role to play, but I think we as citizens, we do have a role to play as well. So at the IEA, we have actually done a small playing my part, which explains to us citizens, what can we do? What can we do? And to achieve a number of things. First, we can save money. The poorest of the Europeans now are really having difficulties paying their bills by the end of the month. So the package we put together can save around 500 euros for an average family. Second, it can help the current energy crisis. I give one example: taking down your thermostat. On average, European houses are warmed around 22.5 degrees. If we turn down one thermostat altogether, we cut 10 BCM. If we turn down 2 degrees, our thermostat is 20 BCM. To give you an idea what 20 BCM is, this is the entire flow of part of Nord Stream, which is the largest, basically, natural gas pipeline from Russia to Europe. So keep in mind, very simple, turn down 2 degrees your thermostat, you still be comfortable, put a jumper on this winter, you will have already avoided a huge amount.
Yeah, I think this is extremely interesting, extremely relevant. This question of how much can we achieve in very short time by pretty simple behavioral changes. As a scientist, we try to get our heads around this. So, like, there are these what we call low-hanging fruits, these very simple, low-cost, win-win options that should be reaped. At the same time, we see a lot of inertia with people's behavior. And the big question is, or maybe it's a billion, maybe even $1 trillion question, how we can how we can realize that potential. And one way is to get it to the attention of people. So that's super important. So you need advertisements, you need information campaigns. But I also think getting this economic incentive in as well is quite important, and it's really important to realize how much hardship these increased energy bills create for lots of families, for lots of poor households. It's really important to take care of that. But I strongly believe that capping prices by government intervention is the wrong approach, because it takes away a large part of the incentives to save as well. So, and it takes away a large part of the awareness also. And thirdly, it also disproportionately helps those with big energy consumption. These tend to be people with richer households, with bigger income. So there's a strong case to be made to help households rather with direct payments as opposed to capping prices.
So what I can hear from the both of you, that you are cautiously optimistic that the current energy crisis could serve as some sort of catalyst towards a faster clean energy transition. Did I get this right, Laura?
I think it could, if we are smart enough. I think Gunnar said that awareness and information are critical. In some countries, I see this happening. In some others, for me, is not as obvious and is not picking up as quickly as we should. So this summer, for oil prices, and next winter for natural gas, are really going to be critical. If we're going to see cuts or restrictions of uses for people and continued high prices, I think we may have effects that are actually opposite of what we would like to see. Instead of having an acceleration of the energy transition, we may see populations and citizens more reluctant. Also because in some instances, we are not really explaining why the high prices are, the reasons of these high prices. At the beginning of winter last year, there was a narrative around that was saying that actually it's the clean energy transition that was putting increasingly high prices. So I think it's incredibly important to explain to the public that this is not the case. What we are living today is a natural gas, fossil fuel driven price spike. The clean energy transition, actually, if we had done it quicker, renewables and energy efficiency, citizens, us, at the end of the day, we would spend less. So this is a big package that I would say information is going to be critical, not to have wrong interpretations of why we are having this high cost of energy and bills. Second, there has to be an acceleration of policies and of incentives. I think this Repower EU in Europe is an excellent example. The money that has been put on the table is an excellent example. Now, does it flow in the real economy? Will it flow in the real economy? Will I be able actually to put the heat pump that I want to do and do my renovation that I want to do? Now, I'm give you my very clear example. I go to the heat pump provider, they tell me I need to wait another 6 months. I want to make the renovation, they tell me not before February next year. So I think that what happens in the real economy at the end of the day will really matter. So there is an information issue, there is a flowing the money issue, there is a simplification of procedure issue. So for me, we do have an opportunity to repeat successes of that we've seen in the 70s of efficiency, of diversification, of innovation, but I wouldn't take it for granted at this point in time. I would like to point, however, one thing, that we are talking a lot about Europe, but Europe is not currently the region of the world that is suffering the most out of this crisis. I'd like to put back on the map that is Africa. Africa already started with the COVID crisis, basically. We were having already 1 in 2 people in Africa not having access to electricity, but since 2013, we had managed actually to decrease the number of people without access to electricity. COVID came, number of people without access to electricity started going up again. Now, last year alone, not only more people were not having access to electricity because simply we did not do the investment to connect more people, put more solar home systems, but 30 million people, because of the energy prices crisis, could not afford to pay for energy anymore. And this year, this is compounded by these very high prices, a food crisis, and climate impacts that are already being felt. So I'd also say that there is clearly a regional dimension that we need to take into account, where there are other parts of the world that are even suffering much more than European consumers are.
I fully agree. I think also the responses need to be differentiated. It's important to realize those opportunities that come from the clean energy transition. It's also very important to realize that we are moving, that we are in a rapidly moving world. So the energy economics is shifting very, very fundamentally. And we've seen an 85% decrease in solar energy production cost over a single decade. I'm not aware of any other energy technology that has reached such huge technological progress within such short time. And there are some issues now with supply chains, but overall in the long term, we expect further decrease of energy, and that creates substantial opportunities. But that also, like a fundamental aspect about the clean energy transition, is that you front load the cost towards the investment side, whereas the operation and the and the actual use of the systems, there the costs decrease because you use renewable stuff as opposed to buying expensive fossils.
Gunnar touched already a bit on the geopolitical aspects of this energy crisis. So how will this influence the current fossil fuel dependencies of countries? Laura, what's your take here?
Overall, I think that the fossil fuel dependency are very intrinsically linked with geopolitical power, and it will remain so. So every transition that moves away from fossil fuel decreases this type of dependencies. I think we shouldn't be naive, though, thinking that the clean energy transition doesn't create other form of dependency. So we would need to be smart enough to anticipate these possible challenges. Here in particular, I'm thinking of critical minerals. Critical minerals are needed throughout the clean energy transition. They're needed for the batteries of our electric vehicles. They're needed for the electricity grid. They're needed for wind turbines. They're needed for solar. So those critical minerals are equally very concentrated in some parts of the world. So we are working at the International Energy Agency with our countries to make sure that actually we have diversified supplies and those don't create an issue going forward in terms of geopolitical, of new geopolitical dependency. So we are really in a very critical decade where the fossil fuel dependency will not disappear from one day to the next. And at the same time, there are new type of energy security concerns that are coming into picture, in particular on critical minerals.
Yeah, Gunnar, you also wanted to say something?
There's really a lesson to be learned, and European dependence on basically a single export country in the case of gas, and that dependence is basically locked into the system because of the pipeline transport. That's a huge part of the story, and that's really a very, very but painful lesson to be learned from that we should not have this happen again. We should not in any of our critically important import commodities have that kind of reliance.
Okay, but what would you suggest then? Like, how would you set our energy system up?
Well, the key point is really like the market shares. So having a market share 40% of all of Europe, 55% in Germany, 100% in some of the Baltic countries. In natural gas, this is just that's toxic, and that's something that we cannot allow. And then, as Laura said, looking into the energy transformation, of course, the role of fossils, it will not vanish immediately, but it will phase out. It will wane as we go into the future, and there will be emerging new import dependencies. And of course, there's a geopolitical dimension. Of course, for Germany very much, but also for Europe as a whole, we will not be able to be fully self-reliant in our energy. We just have a very, very high energy demand density because we have lots of population and lots of economic activity. And there are excellent renewable energy production opportunities outside of Europe. But what this transition offers is a window of opportunity for rearranging these markets. And what we can do is we can diversify, make sure that we have multiple suppliers. And in the example of hydrogen or hydrogen-based fuels, we can get that stuff from Australia, we can get it from the US, we can work together with Chile, we can work together with North Africa, and just having a portfolio is extremely useful. And there, what from the perspective of the European Union is super important is also to team up, to work together, to coordinate.
Yeah, interesting. So when you talk about energy transition, what time frame are you actually talking about? Do we still have time, or does this need to happen in the next 5 to 10 years? Laura, what's your take on this?
I think this is really the decade where we will see if globally we meet or not the 1.5 target. So this decade, our net zero by 2050 analysis, we basically showed the following. Globally, you need to do, if I simplify to the bones, 3 things. First, push very strongly renewables in the electricity sector. Give a number. You take the installation we did of solar and wind in 2020, you need to multiply it by 4 by 2030. Are we on track for this? If I look at 2021 data and 2022 estimates, if we manage to keep the growth rate that we have been seeing over this couple of years, especially for solar, it's not out of reach. So it's something that we could globally do. This would be the first thing. So push very strongly solar and wind. Second, electrify the economy. One example we always make is electric vehicles. Europe electric vehicle sales last year was 20%. So 1 car in 5 we were selling in Europe was an electric vehicle. Globally, it was 1 in 10. If we want to reach net zero by 2050, these numbers need to be 1 car in 2 by 2030. Again, looking at the growth rate of the past couple of years, they have been very high. If we maintain those by 2030, we can get there. Are we electrifying the rest of the economy as quickly as it should? Certainly not, especially for heating. I'd say heat pumps are really lagging behind, so that needs a big push. Other parts of the economy, electrification is also lagging behind, so that needs a big push. Finally, the third thing, so solar and wind, electrification, and third, energy efficiency. If you look at energy efficiency, this is where we are really going very, very slow. We should have we have a magic number that is 4% improvement every year of energy intensity year on year. I don't want to explain what that is, but currently we are doing less than half of that. And to give you one concrete example of why we are not catching up with this, in Europe, we would need to have 3% of our building stock every year refurbished. What we're doing on average is 1%. So this is the area where policymakers will really need to push and bang for this decade. But this is the critical decade. This is the decade where if we don't peak emission, if you don't start seeing decline in especially coal uses, then it's going to be really hard to keep temperature below 1.5 degrees.
Oh la la, clear messages from Laura. Gunnar, what do you say from a scientific perspective?
So for Europe, well, what we know is that for a 1.5 degree consistent development, we need net zero CO2 basically before 2050. And that's relatively consistent with the targets of the European Green Deal, which also have greenhouse gas neutrality, climate neutrality by 2050, which implies an earlier achievement of net zero CO2, just because they are not only CO2 as greenhouse gas, but also methane and N2O and other gases. And because there's limited options to take away CO2 from the atmosphere, that basically means that we have to get rid of almost all fossil energy within 2 to maximum 3 decades. I think I'd rather say 2 decades. And what we see is in our scenario analyses for Europe is that this affects all fossil energy carriers, of course, to the largest extent coal. So we really try to phase out coal as quickly as possible because it has the highest CO2 emissions per unit of energy provided. And by the way, also like for air pollution, it's a relatively critical one. But then it also affects oil and gas, and we see that there is already a substantial reduction of gas demand in Europe by 2030 to reach the Fit for 55, the 55% reduction target by 2030. And that's one of the reasons why it's so counterproductive to take like to question or to loosen up, to water down those European climate targets as a response to the energy crisis. That's what people are currently considering. They're considering taking away emissions trading or increasing the cap in emissions trading to reduce to get a little bit of short-term reduction in economic costs, but that of course on the timescales of 5 to 10 years, that will increase our reliance on fossils and then also make the impacts of the energy crisis worse.
So to wrap up, we've heard there are lots of huge challenges. We need to be fossil-free within the next decade. We need to be quick, and we need to involve everybody, like every single citizen in every single country, but also more importantly, policymakers who need to set the guidelines. How positive are you that we are going to solve the climate crisis and the energy crisis that came on top now? You want to go first, Gunnar?
There's a lot of reason to really put impetus into making this transition work. And there are lots of positive developments. It's ultimately about policy choices if we pull that off fast enough to reach those very, very important climate goals. And then secondly, it's also about dealing with the challenges. And for sure that low carbon transformation is not without challenges. There are multiple challenges. Some of those challenges can be anticipated. We knew about them, and others are unanticipated. And this energy crisis that now has built up, I haven't seen coming a year ago. But it's deep and it requires reaction. And again, it's about policy choices. And what I think is very, very critical for managing this challenge is to balance between different options. And there are these painful ones, like expanding natural gas supply, like switching to coal in some instances, and it will not go without those in the short term, the 1 or 2 years. But on the other hand, there are these other options that really are strongly synergetic, that really pull into the same direction as our needs for climate change mitigation. And those are this emphasis on the demand side, on energy savings, on accelerating the transition away from fossils and towards renewables. And to the extent that we as society or policymakers and other critical decision makers kind of join forces and pull strongly towards this second direction, accelerating the transition, that will make me more optimistic about the long-term future as well.
I actually make a conscious choice of wanting to be positive about it, because I have 2 children, and I am doing everything I can to make the world for them livable. But I want to make a consideration actually based on what I observed on my 2 children that are teenagers. Actually, the environmental consciousness that they have, stemming actually from school, not necessarily from what we discuss at home, is incredibly high. And I think that this younger generation is coming with an amount of awareness and understanding of what are the environmental issues and the climate change issues that is really unprecedented. At the same time, I think that at Glasgow, we came together with a similarly unprecedented amount of ambition from global leaders that we had never seen before. Now, I hope, and what we're trying to do at the IEA is really to put on the table, we have an opportunity in this additional global energy crisis, which is really put a big accelerator. So I want to be optimistic for 3 reasons: for this younger generation that are coming, and in a way to protect them, but also of the incredible awareness. Second, the political leadership we have been seeing recently is unprecedented. And third, this crisis has risks, but is also presenting a huge opportunity.
You've been listening to Sustainability, the Potsdam Dialogues, Science for a Safe Tomorrow.